There you go, being recorded. Hello, welcome to Sasko River Center's Parent Discussion Series. In this series, we offer free parent education presentations organized by a yearly topic. This year, we've been focusing on stress and how it affects various aspects of our life and development. Previous presentations this year focused on, for example, perfectionism, hidden factors of stress, is it stress, learning, sensory, help? These presentations have been recorded and can be viewed on our YouTube channel. You can find these at youtube.com/@Sasko River. I'll paste that into the chat in a minute if you would like to see that in a later time. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Personally, I think that if possible, if you could keep your cameras on, but microphones on mute, that gives some feedback for our presenter. It's helpful and allows us to know who's listening, who's falling asleep, and who's doing their taxes. This presentation will be recorded, and I will be sending out a link to the recording later to all the registrants. David himself will direct you as to how he would like to handle questions, whether they're in the chat box or you pop up and ask them off mute. If you have any follow-up questions after the fact, things you forgot to ask David, I'm sure he'll present his email address so you can contact him. But if not, you can respond to the email that I sent you with the alert for the Zoom link, and I'll make sure that that gets to David, gets routed properly. We got somebody on off mute. All right, anyhow, so I'll fix that in a minute. Today, though, our topic is how do elevated stress levels impact executive function capabilities? We're going to define good stress, bad stress, what the research tells us about how this affects overall performance, and what we can do to support our children, our teachers, ourselves, and much, much, much more. Our host is none other than our own David Kucher. He is learning coach at Sasko River for the last 12 years. And with that, I hand the controls over to David. Welcome, David. Let's hear what you have to say.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark, very much. And thank you, everybody in the chat, everybody on the Zoom who's joined us so far. I'm very happy to see a couple of familiar names and many names that I don't know at all. As Mark said earlier, my name is David Kucher. I am a learning specialist and an executive functions coach. I will talk a little bit about what it means to be an executive functions coach later on as we are moving through the content. Additional background that is pertinent to know: for many, many years, about 6 years, I worked at New Canaan Country School as their learning specialist and the director of learning. And then I moved to Greenwich Country Day School, where I worked for 5 years, also as a learning specialist, first in the middle school and then moving to their newly opened high school to set up a learning support agenda and curriculum and classrooms there. So I have a lot of experience working with students who are both at-risk learners and very mainstreamed, but somewhat challenged learners because of executive function challenges, ADHD, high-functioning autism, slow cognitive processing, things like that. So I look forward to sharing some of my experiences and observations and educational experiences with all of you. As Mark mentioned a couple moments ago, I am interruptible at any given moment. So if in fact you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and just say, David, can I ask? The worst that will happen is I'll say, I get to that later on, and then ask you to mute, and I'll get to it later and we can talk about it later. And I think that's all that I have to say. I'm going to share my screen right now. So everybody now should be seeing a top level introduction to a PowerPoint slide that says, how do elevated stress levels impact? If you don't see that, please unmute yourself and let me know that. As long as you do see that, I'm going to move on. So I start with a slide like this. It's got, the goal of the slide is to sort of put a smile on everybody's face and maybe even make sure that even in all of the challenges that we might have with elevated levels of stress because of, and we can fill in that blank with words like COVID or war or school shootings or teachers who just don't understand or kids who are stuck on their phones all day, or we can fill in with just typical school. Like, what does it mean to be a kid and wake up in the morning and have to go to school and have to have social interaction and homework? All of those, all four of these pictures for me really, really capture a lot of what is going on right now in our world. We've got teachers who are laying on assignment after assignment after assignment, crushing their students. We've got midterms and finals. And then, of course, in the upper right-hand corner, we've got phones and screens that give us this constant non-stop feedback loop that are incredibly challenging to everyone. And so then what do? We turn to our students, we turn to our peers and say, just find a couple of moments, go take a walk, go take a nap, go count to 10. And invariably, none of those things work very well. Maybe they worked, 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago, but they definitely do not work right now with my students and the population with whom I'm working. So that brings us into today, this sense of what it is that we are looking for. What I want to do today is I want to spend a few moments talking about executive functions. What are executive functions? Making sure that we're all on the same page with a definition or a working definition of executive functions. I want to spend a few moments making sure that we tie executive functions to developmental levels and really have a strong understanding that an executive function like attention or focus for someone who is in first grade is incredibly different than attention and focus for someone who is in 10th grade. Then I want to talk about stress and emphasize, I'm even going to begin emphasizing right now, stress is not always a bad thing. Schools are designed to create stress for students. What happens is when we get stress that is bad stress or distress, and we'll get there in a little while, the bad stress has our brains reacting the way our brains are supposed to react. But what's happening today is our brains are reacting to bad stress many, many, many times a day. And that is the unexpected. And I want to talk about what happens in the brain when that takes place. Lastly, I want to move into what can we do? Like, is there something that we can be incredibly conscious of when we are with our kids, with our families, when we're speaking with teachers, when we're taking guidance and feedback from teachers? And I keep going back to teachers mainly because I was a teacher for so long, but also because teachers spend 8 hours a day with your kids. And so teachers see a side of your kids and may have some suggestions for your kids for ways that we can intervene. Lastly, I am going to make sure that we're done and wrapped up and have at least 5 or 10 minutes for questions. And as Mark said earlier, anybody who's got a question beyond the time that we have, I think we've budgeted an hour for today. Anybody who's got a question beyond 11 o'clock, please freely send me an email. My email is just my name, dkucher@sascoriver.com. Before I move on, is there anything or anybody who's on this Zoom who expected something different that I didn't talk about addressing? Okay, so I'm going to move on. So the first thing I want to spend a little bit of time talking about is really coming up with a working definition of executive functions. And it has become such a catchphrase in our school systems over the last, I'm going to say 10, 11, 12 years. And there's always a catchphrase in school. For a little while, it was, what's the essential question? And for a little while, it was using critical friend theory to elucidate and try and come up with ways for all students to collaborate and communicate. The interesting piece about executive functions is that they seem to be here to stay, mainly because they are very, very science-based and science-driven. Executive functions be defined, and I'm not going to read the slide to you, oops, but you'll have it in front of you. Executive functions are really just cognitive processes that help you regulate behavior and control thoughts and actions. Just cognitive processes that let you regulate behavior and control thoughts and actions. So when you think about cognitive processes can include time management. Cognitive processes include forecasting, prioritization, attention, focus, modulation. It includes your ability to make decisions. It includes your ability to get from point A to point B. It includes your ability to absorb new information, hold and store that information, take that information, retrieving previous information, and do something with it. And you see me pointing to the front of my head as I'm doing that because that is exactly where executive functions engage. So you'll see in the notes there, there are different metaphors, the conductor or the coach of the brain. It's often been called the CEO of the brain. But the important part to remember, change the slide to a brain itself, is that the human brain develops from back to front. So if you're looking at this slide, the right-hand side, and even imagining going all the way down, when that baby is born, that baby has, not pictured on here, a cerebellum. And the cerebellum in the baby is what allows the baby to breathe on her own and blink on her own and cry on her own. If a baby were born and couldn't breathe without the assistance of a parent, that would be a really challenging experience. Then, subsequent to the baby being born, the brain develops from back to front. In this particular picture, the brain is developing from the right to the left. So you see the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe. All of those lobes develop over the course of, I'm going to say, 1 day old until 13 years old. And they control tons. They control your vision. They control your hearing. They control your sense of time and space. They control your long-term memory and your short-term memory. They're controlling a tremendous amount. By the time you or your child are 13 or so, they're done developing. And so that's the reason why you can have IQ tests that you take when you are 7, 8, 12, and have the same IQ when you were 20, 25, 30. It's also the reason why if you've got great vision as a 13-year-old, chances are you'll have great vision for the rest of your life. Doesn't mean you won't need distance glasses or reading glasses. What it means is that your brain's ability to decipher what comes in through your eye will stay as acute for the rest of your life because your occipital lobe has developed in that way. And so while your rods and cones inside of your eyes may deteriorate, while your retinal nerve may deteriorate, your brain's ability won't deteriorate. Enter the front of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. So as I said, developing from back to front, the prefrontal cortex right here in the very front of the brain, you can tap your forehead right now and your fingers are half an inch away from touching your prefrontal cortex. That prefrontal cortex develops and continues developing in males until 27 or 28 years old. In females, it develops until about 23, 24 years old. So remember a few moments ago, I spoke about what the prefrontal cortex does. Attention, focus, time management, prioritization, ability to solve problems, decision-making, retrieving information and holding that information while you absorb new information and put them together, analysis, etc. So one of the things that I do, and I do this whenever I meet with a new student or a new family, is I try and walk through all of the things that happen in that prefrontal cortex. And so feel free to laugh at my lack of artistic talent, but you'll see on the left-hand side a face and the prefrontal cortex. What I then do is I stop and look at what are all of the executive function items that are coming from the prefrontal cortex, and how do those executive function items impact for the today, I'm looking at academic skills, but you can also substitute on the academic skills, social skills, athletic skills, familial skills, whatever it is that you want. So if you look at the executive function skills, which are in development, if you have a 14-year-old child, her executive function skills are in development. Her ability to have attention and focus, sustained attention, her ability to start a task and then in the middle of the task, move to a different task, her ability to gauge how long it will take to produce, her ability to have a process around that task. All of that is developing. So I take anything in the right-hand column, the academic skill column. I'll use reading. Reading's great. So you have a homework assignment tonight where you've got to read Act 2, Scene 3 of Romeo and Juliet. Okay, great. So first and foremost, I need to remember to bring the book home. Second, I need to look at my evening. Well, I've got practice right after school, and then I get home and I'm supposed to jump onto a Zoom because I'm doing a collaborative project, and then we eat dinner. And okay, so I can do this probably at 7:30. Great. Now I have to take my book out and sit down to read at 7:30. This is tough reading, and so I like to have a process for that. You need to open up a computer. Maybe I want to read the modern translation of it on SparkNotes first. Maybe that's what my teacher told me to do. But I'm going to open up my computer and sift through all of my tabs, not be tempted by anything else that might wait, ding, my phone just buzzed. Let me check and see what that is. And so you're picking up very quickly on how unbelievably difficult it is to have that process using your executive functions that are in development for any of these academic skills and academic tasks. I often get the question of, but my kid's a great lacrosse player. How come when my kid is out on the lacrosse field, my kid is doing so well? And in some ways, I would say, because the coach and all of the other players are acting as the executive functions for your kid. The coach, the field is already there, the stick is already there, everybody is in their position, the play has already been defined, it's been told what you're going to do, and you're being ushered and escorted to exactly where you're supposed to be. That's part one. Part two is you're also active and moving. You're up and moving as you are doing this. So the combination of those two things means someone is initiating the task for you. Someone is bringing your attention and focus to where it needs to be. If the play shifts mid-play, someone is telling you, or the movement of the ball or the players are telling you what you need to do. You don't have to prioritize. You don't have to forecast. They're all being done for you. Take the same situation and put that in. You have a paper that's due on Friday. It's Monday. You are in high school. The teacher's not going to tell you tonight to go and work on your rough draft. The teacher's not going to tell you tonight to isolate 10 possible quotes for your paper and bring them in tomorrow so we can pick which 3 are the best. The teacher's not going to tell you on Wednesday to take your rough draft to the writing center so that somebody can help you with it. The teacher's not. Now it's Thursday night. And on Thursday night, your paper's due tomorrow. Uh-oh, what do? That's executive functions. And that's exactly what I do as an executive function coach. First and foremost, explain it. Secondly, really try to isolate which executive functions are intact, in development, almost done developing in your child. Then figure out which ones are really underdeveloped and try to figure out how to support and scaffold them. Try to be that lacrosse field for your kid in terms of studying for tests, managing homework, engaging in managing and juggling a schedule, etc. looking at it differently, and it must be said, I don't love this graphic. I have one right after this that I like a little bit more. But what I like about this graphic is that it comes from a very reputable source, Russell Barkley, who is an absolute guru around executive functions and ties executive functions to development. And so you can scroll up and down and you can see a 5-year-old child moving all the way up to a 22-year-old or older child. And with something like that, you get a really strong sense of the shoulds, and big quotation marks from me around the shoulds. So a child who is 12 years old should develop the ability to forecast and prioritize. A child who is 14 years old should be able to verbally, auditorily, visually get new information that is presented to him, be able to retrieve some older information, be able to work with that information and then store that information somewhere, either writing it down or moving it to short or long-term memory. A child who is 16 years old should have an awareness of her attentional capacity and be able to sit in a classroom for 30 minutes and take notes from an auditory or auditory combined with visual lecture. I will tell you that the word should is really challenging for me because, and this is a graphic that I like a little bit better, because the should stops you from stepping back and saying, okay, maybe should, but how about is? This is what my child can handle. And so when your child's in first grade, there's a bell curve. You walk into a first grade classroom and observe from the back of the classroom. And if the teacher says, okay, everybody, here's what I'd really like. Could everybody please go and get your reader out of your desk and come to the circle, sit down anywhere in the circle, and then we'll get started. You've got a couple of kids who go right to their desk, get their reader, and they're sitting in the circle. You've got a lot of kids who get to their desk and say, what did I come here for again? Why am I standing here? What do I need? You've got other kids who are standing and holding their book and saying, what do you want me to do now? You've got other kids who are just wandering around the classroom and saying, I don't remember any of the steps that you told me. All of them fall within that bell curve. Everybody. There's not a student I just mentioned who doesn't fall within that bell curve. The same thing will happen when they sit down to read. One kid is masterful as a first grade reader, and another kid really stumbles and is still playing with phonemes. They're still underneath that big bell curve, that umbrella. Take those same directions and bring them to an 8th grade math class. All right, everyone, can you take out your homework from last night, pass it to your neighbor on your left? We're going to correct those in a couple of moments. That 8th grader who either forgot their homework, the 8th grader who opened up the backpack and looks in and says, I don't know where I put my homework. The 8th grader who pulls out the homework, but now what do I do with it? I'm looking around trying to see. That 8th grader is at the very end of the bell curve, meaning just about falling out. Those are the kids that you're getting notes from teachers who are saying, your kid struggles to follow directions. Your kid struggles to collaborate in my classroom. I have to repeat over and over again for. Take that same thing and remove it and move it to 11th grade. You've got an 11th grader who walks into her classroom and, okay, everybody, take out your homework. Oh, I don't have it. I didn't do it. What did you ask me again? How do I? Now that kid is outside of the bell curve. So I like the bell curve a little bit more than the Barkley, like this is what should happen. Because for that 11th grader, I remove the should. Here's what does happen. This 11th grader did her homework last night, but for whatever reason, forgot to put it into her backpack. Now, the 11th grader is sitting in class and the homework is home. How do we scaffold that? What do we do with that to make sure that tomorrow that doesn't happen? Is there a way to work with that? And that is fundamentally the way that I think a lot about executive functions. So before I move on, does everybody feel like they've got a working definition of executive functions, and at the very least, how that executive function bell curve, executive functions with academic skills? I know I focused more on academic skills than anything else, but executive functions and academic skills linked together under a bell curve. Is there anyone who's got a question before I move on? Okay, I shall move on. So what I wanted to do was just take a few moments to talk about some of the warning signs. As I said earlier, in first grade, you're not going to, while you might have a teacher who with a smile on his face says to you, yeah, Sam's always the last kid to get into that learning circle. You might have that. Sam makes it to the learning circle and everybody's got a smile on their face. As Sam gets older, some of the things that you can notice when you're seeing Sam as a fourth grader or a sixth grader, that Sam, for whatever reason, really is constantly missing something. Sam is often the kid who said, wait, you didn't say that. You said we were going to do that on Saturday? I don't remember that. And you'll say, right, we talked about it at dinner and it's on the calendar. And you even put something together for it. Oh yeah, right, now I remember that. Sam becomes very challenged at managing time. Dinner's at 6 o'clock. It's now 6:05, 6:10. Sam is nowhere to be found. And you have to go and constantly chase Sam down. Totally cool as a first grader, probably a little bit less cool as a sixth grader, and almost unacceptable as a 9th, 10th grader. Sam is disorganized. And I don't mean, the 11th grader who leaves clothes on the floor, because every 11th grader leaves clothes on the floor. I mean the kid who's got a backpack and you say, hey, where are your glasses? Oh, I don't know. I haven't seen them in a few days. Where are those headphones that you just got for Christmas? Oh yeah, I had them the other day and now I can't find them. Maybe I left them in the car. Where are your shoes for? Where are the, that type of thing. That's a disorganization that is creating disruption. And clothes on the floor, if they're creating a disruption, maybe that's the thing in your home and that's cool. I'm certainly not telling you not to focus on that, but it's really something that's creating this disruption and hardship. Kid who's having difficulty completing tasks, always has an outstanding assignment. There's always overdue assignments. Even things that you might notice that you do as a family. So for example, if you're all watching a movie as a family and you notice that you've got a kid who is somehow having trouble following the plot line. What's going on in this movie? Or I didn't realize that that character died. I didn't realize that that character was also that type of thing. So all of those things can be potential warning signs. The other potential warning sign is the obvious, and it's why I keep coming back to teachers. Checking in with teachers to say, how's my kid doing when it comes to getting tasks done? How's my kid doing when it comes to collaborating with other people? How does my kid do when it comes to working memory? We're really good at asking questions around the academic skill. How's my kid as a reader? How's my kid as a mathematician? How's my kid in Spanish? Great. We often don't ask the questions around the skills that are required of my kid. How prepared is my kid? For how many minutes do you think my kid does well with an auditory lecture? How often is my kid tested on being able to task initiate, task shift, and produce? Do you notice that my kid is equal with other peers in her grade? So even asking the question in a slightly different way can help you take ownership of potential warning signs that you might see. And then we enter the world of stress. So I'm not saying at all that, and I don't know how old people are on this phone call, but I certainly grew up with stress. But I did not grow up with some of the stressors that my students are experiencing right now. In just the last couple of years, we're all aware of the stress that COVID has caused. And we're all aware of the stress that online learning has caused. More than anything, it has increased anxiety. in my lifetime, I didn't have a sense as a child that there was no possible way of not knowing what tomorrow would be, not knowing if I could control tomorrow. But we have an entire generation of kids that are around us who have grown up with this sense of the unknown and the uncontrollable being possibly part of tomorrow. That really affects the executive function development and abilities. The other piece that I want to bring some voice to, especially for anyone here who's got kids right now who are in high school, we had a couple of years of learning where teachers were instructed, please decrease the amount of work that is expected of our kids. So, easy example, my 7th grade students were asked typically to write 5-paragraph essays. They were changed. Let's write 1 paragraph. Let's write 2 paragraphs. I won't take off points for grammar and spelling. Let's not read a 300-page novel. Let's read 2 60-page novels, things like that. Because frankly, we had high anxiety and we were also working over this Zoom medium. The challenge with that is that now those 7th graders are in 9th grade or 10th grade. Teachers are back to, okay, everybody, we're going to work on a research paper. And there's not a lot of forgiveness for those students who potentially didn't learn and have the practice and experience of being able to write a 1-paragraph, get feedback in notes, rewrite it to a 2-paragraph, get feedback in notes, what have you. So there's a lot of practice that didn't happen. There's a lot of curriculum and content that didn't happen. So all of this leads to the idea of stress. Now, the first stress to be aware of is eustress, E-U-S-T-R-E-S-S. Eustress is the good stress. School is built to provide eustress, and schools are very good at it. It is important to have deadline dates. It is important to have homework assignments. It is important to know that you're going to be called on third and you have to stand up in front of everybody and read 4 sentences from the paragraph out loud. It is important that this coming Friday is a tough one because you've got a math test and a science quiz and you and your group are presenting in Spanish. All of that is eustress. And every study indicates that having the right amount of eustress in your life leads to optimization in performance. That's incredible and really important to remember. And because when you have a kid who comes home and says, oh, this week is so tough, I've got this and that and this and that, your job as the adult voice in that kid's life is to be able to identify, yeah, that's eustress. You're supposed to have that. Great. Good luck with it. If I can help at all, let me know. But if the kid is coming home and the kid is completely overwhelmed and the kid absolutely cannot get anything done and becomes stuck and the kid is exhibiting either anxiety signs or depressed signs, that is distress. That's the opposite of eustress. That is a stress that is going to impact performance. And having a little bit of distress here and there, okay, that's what life is. But that's not necessarily what school is. So when you overlay the idea of COVID, or you overlay the idea of incessant phone access, or you overlay the idea of never feeling like you can achieve, never feeling like you can perform, that distress is what leads to anxiety. And you hear it being discussed all over the place, whether we're talking about PTSD or generalized anxiety disorder or phobias that are emerging. That's the piece that you want to keep your awareness on. Has eustress led to distress? Has distress been introduced to a point that it is moving these kids into an anxiety place? You've probably seen this chart before. This is actually something that was developed in the early 1900s as during the emergence of schools, interestingly enough. And it's a Yerke-Stotson law, the stress performance curve. So it's just trying to visually give a sense of where it is that you're falling on a day over day basis. And you want to be somewhere in that optimal stress period. So if I'm reading from left to right, that second piece in the bell curve, where that is you're receiving optimal stress on a day over day or hour over hour period of time. But this gives you a sense of how to maybe measure your level of stress or your child's level of stress. Are you at picking 4 different lines? Are you at a level 1, 2, 3, or 4? And if you're at a level 3 or 4, is that something that you can handle for the day, the hour? Or is that something that is going to impact you so much that you are not going to be able to perform, produce, so that you can get back to that second level, optimal level? And the piece is, I mean, I'm not ashamed to admit that I hit distress all the time. I'm really aware of distress to me when I lose my ability to focus. I notice it when I'm in my car and I'm coming home from work and someone cuts me off, or someone in front of me didn't go through the light, and now I'm sitting through the light a second time. And instead of having the reaction of, you know, that's really terrible, I wish that that person had gone through the light and I'm on my way home already because I'm really hungry, my reaction becomes off the charts, screaming in my car, what is he doing? Why are you? That type of thing. You explode. Sit down to work on an email and your computer battery is dead and you forgot your charger and you explode. That is a really good sign of, I've got distress in my life. I don't have one moment of, oh gosh, that's really rough. That is an explosion that is taking place because of the distress in my life. And if you've got that happening over and over and over and over again, that's what leads to the anxiety or the depression in you and or your kid. And that's the piece that I want to make sure that we are keeping our eye on. Once you start thinking about executive function skills and stress, the piece that I often come back to is the idea of what is accurate amounts of stress and what is inaccurate amounts of stress. If your kid comes to you and says, tomorrow I've got to stand up in front of the room and a poem that I'm working on, memorizing, I've got to read to everybody in the class, I'm really, really nervous. Great, you should be really, really nervous. It's nerve-wracking to stand up in front of a group of people and recite something. That's exactly on target. School's doing its job, yay. But if your kid is hiding, or your kid is saying, I can't go to school tomorrow, I'm gonna be sick, or your kid is refusing school, or what's happening is that there is some increased level of cortisol that is being released into the prefrontal cortex of your brain, and it is causing distress. That is the piece. Cortisol that is released into your brain affects your limbic system. And so you really are no longer able to make decisions or problem solve or have any attention or focus. It eliminates your ability to prioritize, to produce, to get anything done. It really changes the level of any ability to be a critical thinker. That's important. So this is the moment where I want to make sure that we are all on the same page. We've got a kid who is a typical developmental cycle learner. That kid in first grade is developing executive functions, and maybe she is a really great reader, but she is a really terrible time manager or direction follower. She's in the bell curve. And by 8th grade, she actually is now an at grade level reader and a good direction follower. She's in the bell curve. And by 11th grade, she's established that there are a couple of classes she's just naturally good at. And there are a couple of classes that she's got to work at. So when she has to write a paper, she's stressed. She knows she's got to start that a week and a half ahead of time, even though there's a lot of kids in the class who wait until they start in the classroom a couple of days ahead of time. But she starts a week and a half ahead of time. And other classes she doesn't really study for. She's stressed, but she is not distressed. Her executive functions are developing in a way that allows her to figure out how to be an independent, fill in the blank, learner, athlete, friend, daughter, you name it. You have those other kids who are more atypical. And so the atypical can be anywhere on the continuum. He was in first grade, he was under the bell curve, but by 8th grade, he is the, I don't follow directions. So he takes the math test that says, round to the nearest 10th and circle your answer. And even though he gets the right answer 50% of the time, he doesn't follow the directions. And so he winds up getting a 30 on the math test and has to retake it. And then as he gets older, his direction following abilities are even more hampered. So he's not providing 4 pieces of evidence on the research paper. He only provided 2. And one was not a primary source, it was a secondary source, but he called it a primary source because it was the first one that he found and it covers the entire topic. But he didn't go and check it out with the teacher or with a peer, and. This is a kid who has executive function challenges, whose executive functions need to be scaffolded as an 8th grader or an 11th grader. Enter the kid who is in 10th grade, who is constantly saying, I can't get this done, I can't get that done. I looked at my phone and this thing is happening, and this kid said this thing about me, and this other kid sent me a Snapchat, and this was a real thing, and look at what's going on in the news, and this is a real problem, and I'm supposed to be doing my homework right now, but I just can't do that, and I can't. This is a kid who may or may not have executive function problems, but a kid who is distressed, a kid who is affected by what is going on in the world, or his or her world, that's creating so much anxiety or distress or panic that they are unable to engage their executive functions. And their executive functions are not being tested, so their executive functions are not developing at age level. And they probably, as they manage or learn how to manage their distress, are going to find themselves with executive function challenges, whether that is developmental or not, because they didn't have the opportunity to work on them. So I'm putting these in a few different categories and really going out of my way to make sure, because you spend more time with your kids than anybody. And so your job is to be able to help guide, is that executive function challenge? Is that something that we need to do something about? Is that distress? Is that, and to be able to really try and figure out the difference between A and B and C. But also remembering your own cortisol levels. Everyone who is on this Zoom with me right now has moments in their life where their cortisol level just explodes. And that is the moment where you can't make a good decision. Once your cortisol level explodes and then dissipates, you more likely than not enter a kind of a depressed place where you also can't make good decisions. I often equate that with, for anybody who consumes alcohol, the 2 martini decision. You cannot make a good decision. You cannot produce effectively on that 2nd martini. You cannot produce effectively when your cortisol levels are that high. You are in distress or post-distress. And if your kids are experiencing that, it's no wonder that they're unable to produce. So what I want to do is I want to move on to some ideas around what can we do about this? How do we recognize it? What do we do about it? Before I do that, does anyone have any questions for me, comments for me, anything that I should be addressing that I'm not addressing? Okay. So moving on, one of the things that's really important about the human brain is understanding that the human brain does not like lack of control. And the human brain is constantly searching for ways to control. And in some ways, that is exactly what the cell phone has given a lot of people, this method of being able to control. We no longer are able to sit with, who won the Super Bowl 3 years ago? We don't sit with that. We say, hey, Siri, hey, Alexa, who won the Super Bowl in 2020? And that's a silly and reductive example, but that lack of control triggers your emotional centers. And so back to the idea of during COVID, you didn't learn how to use noodle tools. You didn't learn how to research. You didn't learn how to embed quotes. You didn't learn how to vet quotes. You didn't practice all of these things enough. Now you're being asked to do those and you are struggling. How do you help work with your kid around that? The other piece is that once you hit that 8th grade level and above, you are generally judged on result. You're not judged as much on effort. So you've got a kid who says, all right, fine, I'm going to change my process. I'm going to go out of my way to show all of my work on my math homework. Okay, great. This kid goes and turns in the homework the next day and still gets 5 wrong out of 10. I still didn't get the right answer. And doesn't happen to have a teacher who's giving partial credit. Okay, becomes up to us to say, yeah, but look what you did. You showed, we now know exactly why you got these wrong, because you're showing your effort. Amazing. So those are kind of the items that we as the adults in the lives of these kids have to spend time doing. It is, the word to think about is adaptability. How are we going to help guide ourselves and our children to adaptability? First is recognizing the brain and that the brain is unbelievably adaptable, whether for flexibility and resilience, self-control. We ultimately had COVID show up and we ultimately looked COVID in the face and said, okay, we're going to figure this out. We're going to learn at home. We're going to support learning at home. We are going to adapt and face something that is a little bit of the unknown. And now flash forward 3 years, we're back in school. Most of us are not wearing masks. Many of us are vaccinated. We are saying, bring it on. We're ready for it. We've become more resilient. And it's important that we frame that. When a student gets a bad grade, it's easy to say, oh, yeah, well, better luck next time. It's way less easy to say, that grade is a gift. Why did you get that bad grade? How are we going to change that D to a C next time? How are we going to change that C to a B the time after that? What are we going to do with that? That's the adaptability that we are learning to bring to our kids. So when you even think about the research, it takes about 30 times of a repetition to build a new habit. 30 times. That means you want to start going to the gym, you got to go to the gym 30-ish times before it's part of your routine. That's amazing. Kids who learned a lot during COVID didn't get their 30 paragraphs of writing. They got 10. So we've got to supplement that somehow. We've got to help guide them to, here's what we're working on now. So a lot of this for me is a reframing. It's taking something and just making sure that I'm looking at it for what it is. This is a bad grade, but what executive functions go into that? What stress did you have at that time? How can we take this and do something with this? In the home, if it is possible, doing as much as you can do to create ritual and routine. So daily routines or weekday versus weekend routines. making sure that certain things are always in the same place. You walk in the door, you always put your keys here. You walk in the door, you always put your shoes here. You walk in the door, you always put your backpack there. Packing your backpack the night before, things like that. Anything that can come with a ritual and a routine that you can bring voice to later becomes incredibly helpful. Using the language that I'm using today that I would call executive function language. So things like, instead of, how much homework do you have tonight? Say, what time are you going to work on your homework? Or how long will it take you to finish your math homework this evening, do you think? Something along those lines. That creates a transparency and an intentionality around executive functions for kids. Even bringing the words executive functions into your household become incredibly important. Mindfulness. So I know we've heard this. In some ways, this is as much of a buzzword as executive functions, but trying to stay present and in the moment, trying to use language around a growth mindset. Yeah, that's a bummer. You got a C- on this paper. How are we going to grow from that? What do you want to get on the next paper? Let's look and see what the teacher had to say and see if that is something that we can, that type of thing. Yeah, you lost today's game. All right, I got it. But I wonder what happens next time. Is there a way to grow from something like that? Making certain that everyone in the household is getting enough sleep. And if they're not, figuring out why that's the case. So is it the temperature of the room? Is it eating too late? Is it having screen time before you go to bed? But going out of your way to make sure that sleep is prioritized inside of the household as much as possible. In equal measure, setting aside time where play is prioritized in the household. I always love this quote. The opposite of play is not work. The opposite of play is depression. So even the play that you experience in school, there's a lot of play. Teachers are educated today about bringing game theory to their classrooms. So you see kids using Kahoots, and you see kids using Quizlets, and using the test, the test mode on Quizlets and things like that. How do you bring some of those items to your household, or allocate enough time to make sure that your kids are getting enough time to play? Even if that play is Xbox for a prescribed period of time with someone that your kids never met. That's play, and it's important to balance that with work. Lastly, making sure that you are building in enough time for laughter, which I know seems silly, but if you are not making certain that you've got time in your life and your kid's life to find the amusement in fill in the blank, a comedy, a show, a movie, being able to laugh at yourself, all of these become incredibly, incredibly important. So to summarize that, thinking about how you can understand the brain and brain development, making sure that you have a real awareness of a first grader, second grader executive function expectation, 8th and 9th grader, 10th and 11th grader. And now that you know that, not necessarily being angry at that 10th grader who doesn't manage time well, but bringing an empathy to that and say, how are we going to support that? Like you should, oh wait, not the should word, you don't have the ability to figure out how much time it's going to take to do your homework tonight. Let me help you with that. Let me get somebody to help you with that. Why don't you work with a friend on that? Something along those lines. Creating ritual and routine in the home. Using language wisely, and maybe even introducing executive function language into your home. Creating opportunities for adaptability everywhere. Sleeping, playing, laughing. And honestly, the hardest part, modeling this for your children, for your spouse, for your family, for your teachers, for your community. How do you do all of that? If you can model it, then you can bring voice to it for everyone else around you. And never forgetting that this is a process. We live in a society that often wants us to demonstrate immediate mastery. But the truth is that that is just not the case. School is not about demonstrating immediate mastery. School is about practicing. Sports are about practicing. Life is about practicing. Being a parent is about practicing. Repeat, make mistakes, do an after action review, grow from your mistakes. Repeat again. And when you do that, you will find small and steady growth each step of the way. And I think that's about all I have to say. I've got a bibliography here. I will work with Mark to get that out to everyone in case you have interest in any of the articles that I used for some of this. Some of it is relatively new. A lot of it are books that have been on the shelves for years and years and years. But I think that's pretty much what I have to say. And we've got, I think, a few minutes left for some questions. So if anybody has any questions, actually, I suppose I should look at the chat. Okay, so what to do with the 15-year-old who answers no to questions, suggestions, offers of support? Fantastic question. I have a lot of students who say no. One of the pieces to, I mean, I guess I would have to know a little bit more about what the questions are. Do you have homework tonight? No. Do you need help with your homework? No. Do you want to have this for dinner tonight? No. Some of that is a teenager being a teenager, of course. Some of that could in fact be someone who is afraid of saying yes, because yes means that I have to do something, I have to produce. Yes might mean that you're going to swoop in and want to see it when it's done. Yes might mean that I have to prove something. So again, back to the idea of what is the language? Do you have homework tonight? Is the question no longer a yes/no question? And I'm being reductive, I'm sure, to the situation. I apologize for that. But does the question become something like, how long will it take you to do your homework tonight? Or is the question, I'm planning dinner for 6:30. Is that work for you? Or that would be yes/no. Planning dinner for 6:30. What are you going to accomplish before 6:30 when we eat dinner? Something like that that might stimulate a conversation instead of offering the yes/no grunt. And again, I'm so clear that I probably am being very reductive to the situation and need far more bullet points in order to be able to give something that would be applicable guidance. But off the top of my head, that is probably how I would approach something like that. I also would eventually ask you and or your child, what stimulates a conversation? Is there anything that stimulates a conversation that's got nothing to do with academics or dinner or chores, or is there anything that stimulates the conversation? A movie, sports, something like that, and see where something like that goes. I'm looking at a couple more. How do you know if the child needs parental support, formal EF coaching, academic psychological testing? I would try and partner more than anything with the teacher or teachers, multiple teachers, to try and get a sense. Are there some classes, some endeavors where your child is demonstrating great executive functions? For example, if your child is a sports player, is your child's bag always packed? Are they always ready? Do they know their sports practice schedule? Do they know their sport game schedule? But none of that applies to academics. Then this child is capable of that. It's a matter of, why isn't this being applied to academics? Is your child struggling across the board everywhere, and your child refuses help from you because of fill in the blank, because you're the parent, or because you are because your child just doesn't want help from you? That's where I might engage something like an executive functions coach. If you are seeing academic challenges and behavioral challenges across the board for that child, that's where I might engage in something like a psychoeducational evaluation, because they all come with something slightly different. But, and again, I think I'm being reductive in my answer, but if we were meeting that is along the lines of what I would say. I would spend a lot more time looking at, where is your child finding success? And where is your child not finding success? And are there patterns and predictability around both of those? And then I would take that and use that as the springboard into how do we find out what we need to know in order to provide scaffolding to this child? Do I know enough based on that analysis to be able to say, let's get you a tutor, or let's get you an executive functions coach and a learning coach, or still scratching our head, let's get an evaluation. That's probably how I would approach something like that. Can you speak to EF developmental milestones? How do we know what are the signals that EF skills are falling outside the umbrella? I guess I would guide you to, and again, I'll ask Mark to perhaps send this out to everybody, Russell Barkley. Russell Barkley is in many ways far more married to the idea of expectation at age level. I'm less married to that. It's why I like the umbrella, or I like the bell curve. But you know, a second grader should be able to follow 2 sets of verbal directions. A 5th grader should be able to sit and take notes for 7 minutes. An 11th grader should be able to watch a YouTube video that's been assigned for 20 minutes and take notes on it and pause as going along to write the notes that she needs as she's going along. I use the word should there 1, 2, 4 times. That's where I like what Russell Barkley has to offer in terms of tying skills directly to the developmental ages and milestones. I don't love the shoulds, because the reality is, if it isn't happening, it's nice to know that others, that the expectation is there at this age or at this grade, but in that it isn't happening, our job is to figure out, now what do we do about it? And so that bumps me back to the previous question. What's the best way to handle overly emotional reactions from an EF challenged child? I don't know. And I don't love the answer, I don't know, but I would have to know the child so much more. You know, we live in the world of reward systems. We live in the world of timeouts. We live in the world of regulation and dysregulation. We live in the world of understanding sensory and vestibular. We live in the world of looking around at psychosocial. I don't know your child enough to be able to say, can we make the child aware of an overly emotional reaction, or at least what we're perceiving, or adults, teachers are perceiving as an overly emotional reaction? Can we make the child aware of it? And can we get the child to the point where the child has an awareness of it coming on? And what will help stimulate a reaction to counterbalance that? And I wouldn't know the child enough to be able to do that. I wouldn't know if you need intervention of a behaviorist, or if you need a learning coach, or if you need somebody who's modifying school curriculum, or I don't know. And that's where my don't know is coming from. But depending upon the age of the child, I think you said 9 to 11, that's still the years of some tantruming. And so it's a matter of what's the right intervention for that child, and being able to identify the stimulus for the tantrum, the stimulus for the reaction, and seeing if you can identify it and bring voice to it to help the child identify and bring voice to it. Is there a source to reference that we could learn more EF language? Yes. There's a guy named George McCloskey. He is my guru. I have studied with him. He and I have done work together where we've presented together at multiple schools in the area. He is, what I like the most about all of his work is that he is, he's just so down to earth. I don't know. He works out of the Philadelphia Child Psychiatric and Pediatric Hospital. And all of the things that he's written that are not in academic journals are just so user-friendly. And so you walk away with this great ability to have language around executive function, time management, modulation, pitch, you name it. So I would recommend that. When should there be pushback to the elementary school to teach executive function skills versus accepting 504 accommodations? Teachers who are on here, please forgive me. This should be curriculum. everything should be skill-driven curriculum, and let the skills guide the curriculum that you are using for each child. And it's very hard to do. It's almost impossible to do in the face of Common Core. It's impossible to do in the face of, we've got to get through all of this curriculum and make sure every kid leaves here with. But if you're not stepping back and looking at the skills that go into your unit tomorrow, and a knowledge that Grayson and Sophia just don't have those skills, you've seen that because it's the 5th week in November. November is not 5 weeks. It's the 4th week in November, and you know that this child does not have those skills, and you're not scaffolding those skills, then you're just setting yourself up for failure over and over and over again. One of my favorite stories to tell is I worked with this teacher at my first school who just complained no end. This child walks in every day and he doesn't have a pencil. This child walks in every day and he doesn't have a pencil. 9th grader. I went out and bought an entire package of pencils and I sharpened them and I gave them to her. And I said, now he has a pencil for the next 30 days. And it solved the problem. This kid was never going to remember a pencil. You know that. You're the adult. He's a 9th grader. He's got executive function challenges. Give him a pencil. I'm a little passionate about that. I apologize, and I apologize especially. I see one teacher colleague on here of mine. I apologize to you. I actually think that we are over time. It's 11:07. Anything else that anyone would like to ask me? Great. I thank you all very much for your time. I hope that you will stay in touch with me and reach out to me if you've got any questions. Right here is my email address. Hang on, I'm gonna right here. There we go. There we go. Feel free to reach out to me with questions that you may have. Feel free to reach out to Sasko River for an executive function coach conversation. And if I can be of any service beyond this, I'm here for you. Thank you all for your time. And indeed, happy Valentine's Day, whoever posted that. Happy Valentine's Day to all of you. Thank you.
David, that was excellent. Thank you so much. A reminder that this has been recorded. I'm going to shut off the recording right now.